Welcome to the 9th ADSD. My name is Ahmed Douh. I'm the head of China Studies Unit at EPC and a non-resident fellow with the Atlantic Council. Today, we're going to talk about the grand topic of alignments and realignments in the world system, but of course, in the context of China's rise. And I understand why all the panels before us wanted to treat you with a little bit of China, because China now is very important, of course, but these were the teasers. Now we are treating you with, or serving you, a full 5-course meal of only China. I hope you'd like it. China obviously is very interesting, but controversial as well. Many people keep criticizing China's increasing assertiveness in the South China Sea, the unprecedented military pressure China is now exerting on Taiwan, and its expansion of its no-limits partnership with Russia, whatever that means, and also its economic and business footprint all over the world through the Belt and Road Initiative, as well as the fueling of what's been known as the wolf warrior diplomacy, and trying to export its technological model. Chinese leaders might argue that China must regain its natural place in the world. But what does that mean? Does this mean China wants to replace the United States as the only superpower in the system? Or does that mean China is actually trying to tell us something? It's trying to say that well, we are presenting an alternative model of great powering, or how a great power should behave. And China is just a lovable great power, only interested in cultural and business interactions with the rest of the world. I keep receiving some interesting questions. And of course, all my friends who are interested in China, I'm sure they get the same questions. And one of them is, what does China really want from us, the rest of the world? You want a more interesting one? Here's one. What does the world imagined by China would look like? And I find this very difficult because you know what? We don't have any consensus whatsoever as to what China really strives to be. But the only sure thing is that China has grown recently to be powerful enough to challenge the United States' position in the system. You know, people say that the U.S. China ideological and geopolitical competition will shape the future of our world. And of course, I'm not surprised. They're right. That's why they call it the most consequential bilateral relationship on planet. And as we speak today, President Xi Jinping and President Joe Biden are meeting for the first time in person since Joe Biden took office back in 2020 on the sidelines of the G20 summit in Bali. Many people are pessimistic about the potential outcome of this summit in the direction of improving the relationship versus the deterioration we've seen happening in the past few years. And, you know, I share those people who are pessimistic because I believe that there are many inherently structural challenges that this relationship is facing, and it will take a lot of time to improve. To discuss these challenges, I'm today joined by a very distinguished panel who are going to talk about this very interesting subject. Here to my left is Mr. Bilahari Kausikan. He's chair of the Middle East Institute at the National University of Singapore. He was previously ambassador at large at the Singaporean Ministry of Foreign Affairs and also Singapore's permanent representative at the United Nations, and also served as ambassador to Russia. Right next to him is Mr. Assaf Orion, retired Brigadier General of the Israeli Army and now director of the Diane and, and Guilford Glazer Israel-China Policy Center at INSS. Right next to him is Mr. Nelson Wong, Vice Chair of the Shanghai Center for RimPac and International Studies, and Chair and Managing Director of the ASEAN Worldwide Group of Companies. And joining us online is Mr. Zhou, retired Senior Colonel of the People's Liberation Army and Senior Fellow at the Center for International Security and Strategy at Tsinghua University. Let me start by setting the scene first and posing this fascinating question that I mentioned earlier to Mr. Kausikan and ask him, what does China really want from the world, and how do you describe its current position in the system?
Well, China is an immense geopolitical, geoeconomic fact that simply cannot be ignored. That's its position in the world. And it's likely to grow more important. At the same time, I think it cannot also be denied that China arouses anxieties and concerns in many countries, almost every country, that also cannot be ignored. And both these aspects form the total reality of China that we must think about. If I give you an example from Southeast Asia, the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies in Singapore does annual surveys of the elites in all 10 ASEAN countries. And if you ask a question, is China important, will it grow important? The overwhelming response across all 10 member states is, of course, yes. But if you ask the same member states and the same elites, do you trust China? Do you think China will do the right thing? The answer is overwhelmingly no in all 10 ASEAN member states. And I think that's pretty much how China is viewed in the world generally. You asked what China wants, and I think this is connected to this kind of dual perception of China. Well, I think Colonel Zhou should be answering that. But from my point of view is this: China justifies, the Chinese Communist Party justifies its right to rule by an ethno-nationalist narrative of humiliation, rejuvenation, and achieving the China dream. Humiliation in the 19th century, rejuvenation under Communist Party leadership, and achieving the China dream eventually. It's a very limiting narrative for a great power. It's also a very entitled narrative. If I give you mentioned the South China Sea in your opening remarks. Arising from this narrative, China has a position roughly like this. This was all mine. It was taken from me when I was weak, and now I'm just reclaiming what was mine. Now that is a very entitled, revanchist kind of narrative that naturally arouses anxieties and makes it very difficult to have a serious diplomatic discussion. If it was all yours, it was stolen from you, what's there to discuss? All right? And I think that is the root cause of these anxieties that certain aspects of Chinese behavior arouse. At the same time, when people do acknowledge you cannot ignore China, you must deal with China. These anxieties are not evenly distributed across the world. They are most acute, I think, in the global north, in the US, in Europe, in Japan, and Australia and other countries like that. And it is unfortunate that for China that these are also China's most important economic partners. The sources of the technology, the management skills, the investments that China most needs. And this, I think, is a remarkable vulnerability in Chinese foreign policy. That said, this divide is not and should not be described as a new Cold War. That is an oversimplification of a very complex relationship. Look, the US and the Soviet Union, they led two different separate systems. Competition was between systems. The US and China are both irreplaceable, vital parts of one single system, connected to each other and to the rest of us by a new phenomenon never before seen in world history. And that new phenomenon is supply chains of a complexity, of a density, of a scope never before seen. And I am very, very skeptical, despite what my friend Cliff Kopan said this morning, that this can entirely bifurcate into two systems. Yes, there will be partial bifurcation, especially in high-tech areas, semiconductors for a start, but the cost of bifurcating it completely into two separate systems, the ability to do so is going to be very limited. Whether you start from the premise that the West does or the US does, let us have reshoring or let's reduce dependence, or where the Chinese say, I want to become more self-reliant. All easier said than done. Last year, the volume of US China trade is something like 670 billion US dollars, two-way trade. That doesn't suggest to me a lot of decoupling, yeah? Last point. So it is a very complicated kind of competition. It is not a simple binary competition as was between the US and Soviet Union. And in this complexity, there is hope, because in complexity, there is agency. You know, when I listened to the previous panels on the US, on Europe, I got a little bit irritated, because both of them were talking as if the only choices for the rest of us is to take this side or that side. Actually, that is rubbish. There is always agency for even the smallest country. And in this complexity, there is the opportunity to exercise the agency. Look at Mike. I should not be sitting here talking to all of you if small countries had no agency. Because we became independent in a global situation that is even more dire than it is now, today, in 1965. 1965 was only a few years after the Cuban Missile Crisis. In 1965, the Cold War was hot in Southeast Asia. All of us faced internal communist insurgencies. And we had nothing. We were thrown out of a larger entity, and we were alone. And I'm here talking to you. So small countries always have agency. And in the complexity of the US-China relationship, there is an opportunity to exercise agency. Now, whether you have the brain to see the opportunity and the agility and courage to exercise the opportunity, those are different issues. But the opportunity exists. What we must avoid in confronting these new realignments in the world is a sense of fatalism. Because fatalism is fatal to small states. I stop here.
Thank you. That was very interesting. And, you know, I like it when I hear you talking about the trust issue and the trust deficit that China is actually suffering all over the world. And now I would like to take this very point to Colonel Zhou in China. And, you know, Mr. Kausikan mentioned the problem is mistrust. And now I would like to move this from Southeast Asia to Europe and talk to you about the puzzlement that many observers suffer when they're trying to think about China's position towards the Ukraine war. Why? Because Russia, of course, is a very valuable strategic partner to China, but Ukraine is also a big trade partner to China. And then comes President Putin's nuclear threats. And I read your very interesting article in the Financial Times that actually touched on that, and it was very, very useful in clarifying the components of thinking of many Chinese about the Ukraine war. Now I would like to ask you, Colonel Zhou, what is your perspective on China's strategic goals from its not-so-neutral stand towards the Ukraine war, and what would it take China to change its calculations? Is it the use of nukes in Ukraine, or what?
Yes, thank you, Ahmed. First of all, I really love this opportunity to come to join this great debate again. Let me come straight to your question about China's position on the Ukrainian war. Actually, China is in a somewhat embarrassing situation, being caught between, its strategic partner, Russia, and one of its largest trading partner, that is Ukraine. But what can we do? According to this position, I think China's position is to very carefully, walk along the central line. This is not easy, but this is what we have to do. of our position. Besides, there is another calculation. So should we just, answer the call of Europe, to get away from Russia, then what would happen? The United States and European capital would applaud it. But very soon, the United States would come back to jump on China again. The United States would never be happy just because we keep some distance from Russia. Actually, China has been trying its best to strike a neutral position on this issue on two things. First of all, China did not provide any military assistance to Russia. And this precisely tells that actually this is not a relationship of military alliance. This shows our position as a principled position. And I'm happy you mentioned my opinion published in Financial Times. Actually, I would remind you that actually my piece talking about how China should have a clear-cut, crystal clear position on no use of nuclear weapon was actually published before President Putin said the next day that Russia would not use weapons. And in a few days' time, German Chancellor Scholz met with President Xi Jinping. And when German Chancellor Scholz mentioned about no use of nuclear weapons in Europe, it was fully endorsed by President Xi Jinping, who repeated China's decades-old principle of no use of nuclear weapons, because China, ever since it detonated its first nuclear devices in the 1960s, has made it quite clear that China would never be the first to use nuclear weapons against any countries or against any region. So this has been our position. Many Chinese foreign policies and defense policy have changed, but not this one. So I'm very happy President Xi talked about this, and I'm wondering whether he would repeat this in his bilateral talks with President Biden. The meeting is still ongoing. I think I'm somewhat positive because I'm almost sure that President Biden will mention about the Ukrainian war, and of course, this kind of possibility is most frightening. And I believe President Biden probably will mention it, and I'm sure President Xi would give Chinese assurance about how it should not happen at all in Europe. Because this is not about how China would think about its friendship with Russia. This is about humanity. Use of nuclear weapon is against humanity. And for Russia, we're not asking Russia to do something extra. We just ask Russia, our friend, to honor its own words. That is, nuclear weapons should not be used, and nuclear war can never be won. Thank you.
But thank you so much. But from the, just a follow-on question, from the bigger perspective, does China see Russia the biggest player to rely on to change the world order, or at least from Chinese perspective, fix it in the long term?
Well, China and Russia see the world in a different manner. Because from my understanding, Russia actually doesn't like the existing international order because it considers itself victim of the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and actually has not gained much from globalization. But China is totally different. China actually, in the last 4 decades and plus, has benefited tremendously from globalization, from the existing order. Many people got it wrong to consider this order is liberal international order. I never believe there is anything like a liberal international order. Let me just remind you common sense. The international order is just like a garden. It is diversified. It's full of different things. It is full of things like different customs, different religions, different culture, and different system. Something like culture and custom could have lasted more than 1,000 years. So the so-called liberal international order was actually coined by the West to mean some kind of order after the Second World War, which is totally wrong. Why? Let's just look at what had happened after Second World War. First of all, there is a rivalry between two camps that have lasted for decades. So how can this order be just a liberal international order? Then it is shaped by major international events, like the independence of 53 African countries. This is a huge international and historical events. And then we have China's huge influence in the Third World. And then this order is also shaped by major events like the climate change, like long proliferation, like all this. So if there is anything that looks somewhat like liberal international order, that is just about 15 years after the dissolution of the Soviet Union and before the full rise of China. So this is the myth. So the European countries, well, the West, led by the United States, just wrongly consider because the rules and regimes after Second World War was to a great extent made by the West. Therefore, the order is made by the West. No, these are two different things. And let me come back to China. Just think for a moment, which international rules and regime is not joined by China? China has joined all of them, yeah? So China supports this order. So China would like to improve the order wherever possible. So that is the fundamental difference between China and Russia.
Yeah, thank you.
Besides, let me say a few words about
we will come back. We will come back if you don't
comment.
mind, Colonel Zhou. We will come back to this. We will come back again to this point.
Regarding China is very positive, and
Colonel
the global
Zhou,
South
you hear me?
is more than 70% of international the world's population, and China's image in South Asia is not totally like what Bilahari has said, that when everybody just is agree to China's influence, but disagree about China's image. I don't think so. I think the fact is Southeast Asian countries would not like to take sides. And there are countries, like Laos and Cambodia,
Colonel Zhou,
at least
do you hear me?
of them are very much pro-China.
Okay, thank you. I don't know if you hear me, but I'm sorry I had to cut you off because the answer took so long. I would just like to bring in Mr. Wong about changing the world order again from Chinese perspective, and actually this time from Western perspective, because a lot of people say that the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, is actually China's approach to change the world order. It's China's grand strategy. I would like to hear a short answer from you on that, because I have a follow-up question on the same point.
Thank you. Thank you very much. First of all, I must thank our host, Madam President, for inviting me to the Abu Dhabi strategic debate. This is my first time, and it's a great honor. I have to say, before answering your question, that throughout the event until now, I feel quite happy, in a sense, that my country's name has been constantly mentioned in almost every session. But then I'm also a little puzzled that I'm actually quite alone here. I'm the only one that is sitting here from China. So I'll try to cope with the questions you might have and to give you an answer in my honest opinion. As you have mentioned in your introduction of me, I do have two entities that I represent. One is a think tank. The other one is a business organization, which is an investment and business consultancy. So, answering your question about Belt and Road Initiative, I actually had the opportunity to talk about the Belt and Road Initiative, whether it's a grand Chinese strategy globally or something else. And I said, based on my own understanding and observation over the years, I said, you have to understand where China comes from, why there is such an initiative. In the first place, I said, for people that have been visiting or living and working in China, you must have seen that the entire country has a very comprehensive road system, highway system, and high-speed train system. It's all built, and that was not done overnight. It was decades of hard work. But in the meantime, after everything is done, has anyone thought about how many steel plants and cement plants there are in China that has supported the construction and the building of the massive infrastructure work throughout this country? So when this is all done, what's next? If you start shutting down one steel plant, that will mean 50 to 60,000 workers getting unemployed. So this is a very realistic question. So I'm just talking about steel plant or cement plants as an example. Looking at China's economy overall, it has now become the second largest economy in the world, but in the meantime, it has a big production capacity in almost every line of industry. So the economy has developed into kind of a bottleneck that needs to ooze out. So that's why China needs to look at markets outside the country for continuous economic expansion. So this is actually where I would say where the Belt and Road Initiative comes from, to look for new markets, to look for new partners, new projects. So
the answer is no. It's not the grand strategy of China.
I wouldn't say it's a grand strategy to start with.
Okay.
The incentive for such an initiative to come out is to solve domestic problems.
So the follow-up question actually was, the BRI now is facing great challenges, starting from the low economic growth in China, and this will stay with us. It's not going to go anywhere. Yeah. You've got low productivity. You've got the zero COVID policy, which is denting the business community in China. And also you've got a looming debt crisis because of the massive amount of lending abroad. So the Belt and Road Initiative now, some say it is being restructured quietly. Do you agree with that? And if no, how do you see the threats and challenges I mentioned affecting the future of the BRI?
Well, I think to answer your question, I have to say that there has been a lot of misunderstanding about China. And this is why dialogues like this is quite necessary. For me, as a Chinese national, coming out to participate in debates and discussions like this is quite important, because I have been observing all the comments about China over the years. And the reason that I've decided to participate in think tank activities is that I have discovered great misunderstanding. And people tend to forget the fact that almost all of the predictions by, let's call it the West, towards China and the government, none of them has been ever correct. That China is going to fall, the Communist Party is going to fall, but nothing like this has ever happened. Why? I have constantly asked the same question myself, actually, and then one day I came up with an answer. after going back to my motherland for the last 15 to 17 years, I realized all of a sudden, I said, wow, even people, and also including myself, have neglected the three basic fundamentals when it comes to looking at China. Number one is, what does 1.4 billion people mean? And number two is, China is not a small country. It's one of the largest countries in terms of land mass in the world. And number three is that China is a country with the Communist Party as the dominating and leading party of the country. Now, Russia is bigger than China in terms of land mass, but Russia doesn't have 1.4 billion people. India has a great population, a big population as well, but it doesn't have one party as a dominating party running the country. So I said, when you put these three elements together in one country, and when it's spinning, it generates unimaginably amount of energy. So when people say, your economy is developing towards a direction that is going to fail, your financial market is going to crash, your real estate bubble is going to go bust, I said, yes, if it is under a different country scenario. But when you look at China, with all these three elements I mentioned above put together, things will be different, because the country can always find a new engine.
Oh, okay. Can we? Thank you so much. We will go back to this in a minute in the context of China-US. But I would like to go back to the China-US again with you, Mr. Orion. And as I mentioned before, Presidents Biden and Xi are meeting today for the first time in person. And you know, they had a great friendship before when the two were vices. But now, of course, the bilateral relationship has deteriorated significantly. But they are meeting after two domestic developments. President Xi Jinping consolidated his power after the 20th Party Congress that happened in October. And the Democrats actually did much better than was expected in the midterms. So do you think these two domestic developments would actually positively recalibrate the relationship in the future?
It's good to be back. Thank you for inviting, and thank you for the question. It was proposed here before that we were talking about climate changes. I think we're talking about world tectonics. So yesterday's shower are a point on time, but not that significant. I think we need to try to approach it from a high level, zoom out perspective, with the great trends shaping the relations between the two powers. And we've, I think, just have seen a turn in time. If we want to go from the World War II, Cold War, post-Cold War, and now maybe the post-Cold War, when America began identifying China as a possible issue, it was probably 2000, but then got distracted by bin Laden and 9/11 into 2 decades of investment in the Middle East and the global war on terror. Now, America's issue is that it's a global power. We should be able to multitask, but it usually focuses on we're now witnessing America looking at Ukraine without losing sight of China, which is quite rare. The trajectory of this growth that Nelson spoke about, and America's recognition that it has a problem, I think we could see the indicators about a decade ago, speaking about America's Pacific century, about the pivot that everybody in the Middle East takes as abduction. But it's actually refocusing, rebalancing, repositioning. And since at least the two national security strategies of 17 and 22, America says global war on terrorism is over. We're now looking at China as our number one challenge. And another, so to speak, non-geographical issue is that America and China identify technology as the high ground for future dominance. And that's a definer in their relations. Both of them are looking at life in a holistic way, generating power from economy and then translating it to politics and policy. America certainly on the military side. China is trying, I don't know if to catch up. The purposes are catching up. World-class power by 2049 is a national purpose. And world-class means on par with the US. But both of these are looking at across-the-board power and how to work with each other. Certainly China, as Bilahari said, is looking for a place at the table which becomes its current power and power perception with a lot of entitlement, as was mentioned here before. It wants to play by the rules, but also shape them. In the Russia panel, it was mentioned that they don't want to disrupt. Yes, but they want to mold it. And America is the shaper of the current order, and would like to preserve it. And as was mentioned here before on how such collisions begin, they begin with general perceptions. Look at the miscommunication just here of people speaking across each other, misunderstanding each other truly. America certainly woke up at the wheel, said, whoa, what happened here in the last decade or two? And there's an adrenaline rush of trying to catch up and fix things. They both identify common interests, but their politics stands in the way of directly addressing them. So even when Pelosi came to visit Taiwan, China suspended the military talks and the climate talks. So now we see, I think, a good sign in trying to keep communication channels open. Within China, I think the outside world is looking at a more cohesive leadership aligned with the Secretary General, much more hardline, much more ideological. America defines it as an ideological issue between autocracies and democracies. And what Nelson mentioned of going from the inside out. So whatever starts in China as an economic and maybe connect East and West project turns to spill over. So when we hear that China operates exterritorial police stations in the Netherlands and in Canada and so on, because its sense of state security incorporates overseas Chinese. That's part of the party concept. So that comes with some collision against other nations' sovereignties. The important thing I think is to understand that both great powers don't want war. It's disastrous. Nobody wants it. But I grew to believe that Barbara Tuchman's March of Folly, it's not a book, it's a binder. And everybody can add its own folder. Miscalculation happens, something begins. Like in 2001, there was the Hainan crash incident. It was dealt with smartly, but it was on calmer seas. Taiwan is quite a tinderbox in this essence, or in this sense. And despite the fact that it will be disastrous because of the semiconductor supply chain, you can't rule it out. So
we are actually going to talk about Taiwan right now, and I'll take from what you said about the indesirable sense with the two global powers to avoid, or the desire to avoid war over Taiwan. And I would like to turn to Colonel Zhou. And first of all, I would like to test the connection. Can you hear me clearly now?
Yes.
Could you please keep this answer brief? And I would like to ask you about the military, China's PLA, because during the party congress, President Xi Jinping emphasized the 2027 goal and basically achieving modernization of national defense by 2035 and becoming a world-class military, as Mr. Orion mentioned, by mid-century. Do you have perspective on what China might do about Taiwan? Can they actually, President Xi Jinping and the CCP, wait for so long on Taiwan and bear the consequences? And 3 minutes answer would be great, please.
Thank you, Ahmed. First of all, you are wrong on the target. So was the Israeli speaker, because it was the target before to become a world-class military by mid-century, that is 2049. But the President Xi has made it quite clear in the Congress report that we have to speed up this process of becoming world-class military. So first, a correction. And then the second thing is about Taiwan. Do we have a timetable for reunification with Taiwan? The answer is no, because we have made it clear that the use of force will only be the last resort. This is often misunderstood, especially after people have watched what happened in Ukraine. These two things are totally irrelevant. China, mainland China and Taiwan are part of one China. These are agreed by most of the countries in the world. And it's not useful for us to have a battered, shattered Taiwan. So we have made it clear that we would have utmost sincerity and utmost efforts to have peaceful reunification with Taiwan. We have to be militarily prepared. It's not because of Taiwan, it's because more of a possible intervention from the United States, for example. The use of force will be the last resort, which we're most reluctant to use. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I didn't know actually that President Xi's emphasizing the acceleration of reaching this target means making it happen sooner. This is new to me. I've never heard that before, but thank you so much for adding to my information on that. I would like to jump now to the Middle East. And because a lot of people are worrying now about China's growing role in the Middle East and the Gulf region, especially. And recent changes in the leadership structure of China's Communist Party signal that Mr. Xi's strong grip on power and possibly more assertive Chinese posture in the Middle East will actually become more common going forward. If this is the case, Mr. Kausikan, how would the reshuffle at the top impact great power competition, especially in the Middle East. And actually, Dr. Gergash mentioned today the precarious situation of Singapore and the UAE. He didn't mention Singapore, but I'm adding Singapore, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and all the Middle East and Gulf countries between this binary, the US and China.
Well, let me answer that, but give me just two seconds to say something about Taiwan.
Yeah, sure.
I don't think China is ever going to give up the goal of reunification, and I don't think they will ever renounce the use of force as a possible means of reunification. That said, I don't think they are eager to use force to reunify Taiwan, because if they strike at Taiwan, they must win, and they must win quickly, maybe within the first 24 to 48 hours. Otherwise, they have lost. Now, Mr. Putin can survive a fiasco in Ukraine. There is no Chinese leader that can survive a failed operation against Taiwan. And even the roots of Communist Party legitimacy and rule will be shaken. So I don't think they are eager. Now, let me come to the Middle East. I think you have seen in the 20th Party Congress a Chinese leadership that has been unified around Mr. Xi. His power has been enhanced. And if you read his 20th Party Congress speech, which I did 4 times, you will see not a single hint that anything that happened the last 10 years should have been done differently. All right? Now that is, I think, a very dangerous situation. There is an old Chinese saying that the journey of 1,000 miles starts with a single step. That's incomplete. A journey with 1,000 miles starts with a single step in the right direction. Now, the problem with this consolidation of power, and I think you are right, Nelson, that there are certain advantages to having a one-party system. You can pursue a goal relentlessly, provided the goal is correct in the first place. Right? Mr. Deng Xiaoping's decision to reform and open up was certainly correct. Mao Zedong's great leap forward and Cultural Revolution were certainly mistakes. Now, I think the jury is still open now about the direction of China is taking. There are reasons for concern, but as you said, China has certain natural resilience. I would put it in the Chinese people rather than the party or the size. Yeah. Right? Chinese people are very creative. How does this apply to the Middle East? Well, as I said, there is now something akin to a single point of failure in the Chinese system. If the decision is correct, they will play. There is no reason why China should not play a role in the Middle East. What is that role? Right? I don't think China is keen to play a security role. Right? Must be nuts to try to play a security role in the Middle East. Every great power that has tried has failed. Right? But at the same time, great powers, the Middle East has a way of drawing in great powers despite their best intentions. Right now, I think China wants to keep its engagement primarily economic, with only enough security to protect its economic interests. Probably you will see a larger PLA Navy role to protect the energy routes for China. But I think if I was China, right now you are in a sweet spot. You can have a good relation with Iran, you can have a good relation with Israel, you can have a good relation with Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states. And I would try to preserve this as long as possible. Now, I am myself rather skeptical whether this can be preserved forever, but if I was Chinese, I would try to preserve it as long as possible. But again, I come back to this question. There is a great sense of confidence in this present Chinese leadership. Not a single hint in the speech that anything should have been done differently, right? But there is this fact which I mentioned. China's behavior has aroused great anxieties in many countries, diverse countries, including some that are very economically dependent on China. And this is something that actually a leadership would be well advised to think about. You know, unfortunately, I think Chinese diplomacy right now is much more directed towards China rather than host countries. I'll stop here.
That's very, very interesting, as usual. And actually, the problem is the time is so limited, and your answers raise more questions.
That's about China. China always raises more questions.
But now I will take from your point to Mr. Wong and ask him directly, and please keep it short. When will China decide to pick sides in the Middle East? In the Middle East. It's a trap, I know. You don't have to give me a straight answer.
There's a Chinese word, inshallah, you know.
I think this is a tricky question, but the answer is quite simple and straightforward. China doesn't pick sides. Our Singaporean friend has made it very clear and quite correctly. Actually, China basically just wants to do business with everyone. And this is in the spirit of the Chinese nation. We are traders. We want to do business with people. And I want to elaborate a little bit to give you an example for people to understand Chinese culture. Because we have to admit that we are different. And to show you how different Chinese are, I think some of you might have seen Chinese paintings. And the classic Chinese painting, what is the theme? Mountain, fountain coming down from the mountain. We call it 山水画, mountain and water. So when the fountain comes down, it's bound to meet blocks. What does it do? It doesn't go through the block. It finds its way on the side, wherever that is available. So it's coming out like this. Whenever there is a way out, we will find it. This explains why China doesn't enjoy seeking confrontations. China has repeatedly said, we don't seek confrontations with anyone. Why? Yeah, we don't go through the rock. We find the way around the rock. And this is how and who we are, how we operate, how we think. So that's why dealing with Chinese people in business, in politics, I think it is quite important to understand who we are and where we come from. You cannot expect Chinese to think like Americans. Same way you don't expect Chinese to pretend to be someone they are not, or we're not. We are, after all, Chinese. And I think it is absolutely wrong for anybody under the sun to expect that we're going to be living with one language only. We all eat the same food. No, diversity is what makes the world interesting.
So you're saying that under no circumstances China will pick sides in the Middle East, and this is very
And the Middle East is definitely quite friendly with China because China needs the Middle East for energy. And China, as a trading partner, China is going to be quite friendly. And China also wants to sell stuff to Middle East as well. So there is a synergy there.
Thank you so much for this. And I would like to close by asking you, Mr. Orion, to summarize, from your point of view, the future of China-US competition in the Middle East and the Gulf in particular, in the technological, diplomatic, and business spheres?
I think that what was said here definitely reflects China's appetite to do much in security provision. That means no appetite. And this shows us in May 2019, when China's comprehensive strategic partner, Iran, decided to shoot missiles at China's comprehensive strategic partner, Saudi Arabia, you didn't see China providing any public goods on the crisis.
And the UAE as well, this year.
UAE was later. There was a slight difference there
Small.
with some provisions of systems. But even when the energy security, which is a major Chinese interest in the Middle East, we didn't see any provision Western style or anything else. So it's setting the expectations. I don't think anyone expects China to provide public security in the Middle East. And it's very happy free riding with the American security, naval security, and so on, although we see growth of, I would say, military buds of interest in the Middle East, beginning with the counter-piracy force in 2008, Djibouti as a logistical base, then Djibouti as a naval base, more or less, and Gwadar and others. You see a little more military here than it used to. China is definitely going to be active here, already very active in infrastructure because of the BRI issues, but also because it has a digital agenda to provide and a digital architecture to provide which spans beyond its own borders. And that's much about data and communication dominance. And anybody signing up to this, we usually say, oh yes, the US comes with strings attached, and China doesn't. China has its strings attached, but it's different color. Those are red strings. It dictates some issues about Taiwan, about Xinjiang, about what they call the core interest of China. And it comes with the whole of society approach of China to national security. So after you read the cyber law, the intelligence law, the national security law, you understand that you're buying more than just communication. And you need to sign up for this. So I see China active more in the Middle East than it used to. It's becoming more important, despite the theoretical cooperation spaces or potential for cooperation between the US and China in the Middle East. It's going to be difficult, fed by politics. On the US itself is narrowing down the space of choice of smaller actors. What Mr. Gargash said this morning, that we want to be able to do both. The both will be narrower than it used to. We've seen President Biden come to Saudi Arabia and proposing 6G and 5G work. That's a bit of a my way or the Huawei proposal, although Saudi never signed up to no Huawei. The UAE needed to decide between F-35 and Chinese 5G. These are choices. You can't do both. And we'll see more and more of that. Israel, in the past, in the 2000s, was clearly facing a choice between military and defense exports to China and its strategic relations with the US. We chose the US. And now we will see it on other issues like technology, like chips. This partial decoupling, I think we will see it in the Middle East as well. So I think the local players will need to ask how, not which, but how, and which ranges are open for doing both and which are off limits, and you really need to choose in an either-or matter.
That's very interesting, and you mentioned in the end this very interesting narrative about strategic hedging, basically, and whether or not it will work forever. The moment will come, from what I understood, that smaller actors will have to choose or be made to choose or be pressured to choose, right?
It's a choice by choice, field by field, very acute, I would say surgical hedging, because you'll need to decide. Last July, before Biden came to Saudi Arabia, he came to Israel. There was a joint statement on a strategic dialogue on advanced technologies. It was all about, China wasn't mentioned. It was all about China. It said, we are going to cooperate on AI, on quantum, on. But there is a clause on trusted technological ecosystems, which means security against things that are perceived together as potential challenges by China and others.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, time has run out, and we are not going to take any questions from the audience. Thank you so much for all our speakers today. I hope you enjoyed our discussion. Thank you, everyone.